Oh, it's a solo show for yours truly as we break down the 136-125, worse than the margin tells you, loss to the Minnesota Timberwolves. We're going to highlight the struggles of one James Harden, take a look at the importance of the rookie Kessler Edwards, and then the questionable decision-making by Steve Nash, as this one got away from them about midway through the second and just never felt like they were going to fully dig their heels in and get back on track. It's all coming up on a jam-packed episode right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, sir. It's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am your host at Adam Armbrecht over on Twitter, and of course, covering the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast, flying solo on this one, covering the 136-125 pretty ugly loss on the road for the Brooklyn Nets against the Minnesota Timberwolves. We're going to get into this game, some of the things that mattered most as far as what led to the loss, take a look at this road trip overall, key performances from James Harden, and then also what it means now going ahead here as the Nets will head back home first to start taking on the Lakers, and that will be in the absence of Kyrie Irving. But before we do, and along the way, we'll cover Steve Nash as well and some of the late game decisions that he had in this one. Let's call it that. As I say, it's an ugly loss for the Brooklyn Nets. You look at this game and the road trip, 4-game road trip. They came into this one on a 2-game winning streak. We know they lost the first game without Kevin Durant against the Cavs. And there's a lot of matchup problems, I think, that are kind of created here. They obviously come in shorthanded. Still no Nick Claxton in addition to Kevin Durant, in addition to Joe Harris, but the Joe Harris piece is one that they've been dealing with for a long time. So same starting rotation that they've put out there over these last 3 games. And early on, though, this is a team in Minnesota that presents some problems for them. We're going to get to Harden here in a second. But when you take a look at this Minnesota Timberwolves team, they're a team that takes the most three-point attempts in the league. They make the second most three-pointers. They actually struggled from beyond the arc to start this game, eventually found their rhythm, knocking down, by the end of it, 14 of 32, nearly 44% from the field. And then they're also a fast break team. They force a lot of turnovers, and they make points off of them. So while we'll sweep aside here, not quickly, I'm not sidestepping it. Referees matter. Obviously, they can impact the game. It was another really bad refereeing performance in this one. A lot of questionable calls, created a lot of mayhem, right? And I know that you can certainly look at some of these key sequences and say, well, if not for some foul trouble for key players, if not for XY sequences in the game, I get it. But there's plenty here to tell you why the Brooklyn Nets lost this game, even if the referees were pitching a perfect one, so to speak. I mentioned the turnover piece of it. You obviously walk away from this one with 19. That gives Minnesota 28 points off of those. That's an enormous factor. There is the foul attempt disparity that's obviously going to play a role as well. And then also the fast break points, though, doubled up there, 18-9 in favor of Minnesota. So it felt like the type of game that was going to be clunky in a lot of its process along the way. And then, of course, when you think about the fact that Kyrie Irving is basically doing his thing to start this one, but James Harden struggles. I mean, it's plain and simple. He comes into this game, we've said this before a number of times, having up and down performances. And this was another example where it just felt like he was unwilling to lean into the other phases of his game. And we said this before, and Steve Nash has even spoken to this a little bit. And this isn't going to be an over-examination of what James Harden has not been doing well or didn't do well in this particular game. Because, by the way, even though he started this 0 for 6 from the field, inside of those same shares, he had 6, 7, 8 assists, and it's okay to lean into that and not force your hand looking to get your shot too often or dominate possessions necessarily. However, inside of those possessions where he was looking to get his own shot, it keeps coming back to this idea of him needing to lean into the mid-range game a little more. We talk all the time about how Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, even LaMarcus Aldridge, though not tonight, we'll get to him later as well, are kings of the mid-range. They feel very comfortable getting to those spots on the floor and knocking down those shots. Sometimes, and especially against a matchup like this, when you have Karl-Anthony Towns protecting the lane, they have a lot of length on their perimeter defenders, obviously a lot of ability to congest the lane as well. At some point, you have to say it's not working. And again, we can talk about how the referees missed calls, or it was 50-50, the ones that should have been called fouls versus bad decision making by James Harden or trying to force the issue and not having success. But if every time when you think about his process from shooting from the perimeter, where he creates space with a little bit of a jab step and then pulls back, that same exact execution can occur just inside the arc and down to the elbow. And if you are going downhill and attacking at the basket with consistency, 2, 3, 4, 5 possessions in a row when you're on the ball, work into the mid-range game, hit the little floater, hit a little jump shot, and allow it to start to create a little bit of space for yourself. It's going to keep the defender coming out closer to the foul line as opposed to sinking back in towards the basket and waiting for you to bring it your shot into his body, excuse me. And then it's also going to create some of those easy dump off looks for the cutting bigs or for your cutting wings, Bembry, Kessler Edwards, etc. So really did feel like this was one of those microcosm games of where James Harden at times can struggle to adjust to what the game is dictating. The other piece I think when it comes to Harden as well is, and it's again, not a scapegoat for him, but I think unlike Kevin Durant or unlike a Kyrie Irving, James Harden, and he's again mentioned this in post-game press conferences, difficult to adjust. First, you have Kevin Durant. Now he's out. You get back Kai, but he hasn't been a part of the team. You're trying to adjust to some of the new pieces that have obviously been added into this roster from the offseason. Then you get the emergence of some of these rookies like Kessler Edwards, like Day'Ron Sharpe. Nick Claxton doesn't start the season available. Then he's in there for chunky games. Now he finds himself back out of the rotation and out on an injury list, I should say, with the hamstring. And I think that does make it more difficult for Harden. Now, you can say it shouldn't be for the level of player that James Harden is. And again, we saw going back to last year how he had this ebb and flow of moving between facilitator versus scorer. But at its peak is when you have Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving together. Very small sample size going back to last year. But even in the one-on-one opportunities, when you're thinking about with Kevin Durant versus with Kyrie Irving, again, obviously that dynamic starts to look a little bit different when you think about the length that Kevin Durant provides you with and how he influences matchups and how he influences the defense in a different way than Kyrie Irving. None of this, of course, is to make it an excuse for James Harden, but if we agree that his game has shifted a little bit from last year, from the years prior, and maybe just looks a half a step, whatever percentage less than it had, then it is going to be, I think, a little bit more of a process for him to ebb and flow from game to game. Now away games versus home games. Now he'll have, I won't be shocked if these home games he's going to look that much more comfortable, whatever version it is, probably vintage throwback Houston Rockets James Harden, where he's on the ball and he knows exactly what's going to be required of him for the entire 48 minutes or however long he plays. It's difficult. And I think consistency is what you want. You obviously got a lot of that from Kyrie. His stat line ends up looking a little bit more muddled by the end of it because he's taking some of these shots. He's trying to make things happen. But it was a bad one for James Harden. There's no excuse around it. No way to skirt around it at that. Other things that we want to get into here is the importance of one of these rookies. And then we'll talk about Steve Nash and some of the late game sequences, the decision-making that he was using when it came to having foul trouble around a couple of key players. Before we do dive into that, though, got to tell you about our friends over at Truebill. And that's because you may not be aware of this. Free trials, yeah, they go ahead and renew without your consent. It's what you call a business scam to go ahead and get you paying 4 apps or subscriptions that you didn't know were going to renew without your knowledge, without you saying, of course, I want more of it after the 3 months that are free. Maybe you even forgot about it. And that's where Truebill comes in, because it's the new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. On average, people save up to $720 a year with Truebill. Because companies make subscriptions hard to cancel, Truebill makes it incredibly simple. Just link your accounts and Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one simple tap. And your Truebill concierge is even there to let you know that they can negotiate a better rate for the subscriptions that you want to keep. You don't have to worry about those subscription scams anymore. Start canceling today at truebill.com/lockedonnba. Go right now to truebill.com/lockedonnba. It could save you thousands a year. And of course, it's a new year, and that means New Year's resolutions. It's all about getting fit, maybe eating a little bit healthier. And of course, if you're going to do that, you got to make Built Bar a part of your plan. It's because Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar, maybe even a little bit better. I'm not here to cast aspersions, but Built Bar makes it easier to stick to those resolutions about getting in better shape because it just tastes good and, of course, covered in 100% real chocolate. And when you compare them to some of the calories and the sugars that you're running down with these candy bars, it just doesn't make sense, my friends, because compared to a candy bar, 240 calories, 30 grams of sugar, and dozens of net carbs. Meanwhile, Built Bar is giving you 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. That's why you got to head over to Built.com right now and use promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off on your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off on your next order at Built.com. Okay, so then the other piece of this is when you look at this roster and you look at the rotations that they're dealing with right now, as we say, mentioned at the top, you don't have Nicholas Claxton dealing with a hamstring. We know without Durant, we know without one Joe Harris for, since the 14th game of the season at this point. Kessler Edwards, who's been in the starting rotation for the last now 5 games. In this one, if you just went into the box score on the back end of it, and you said that you had Kessler Edwards giving you 29 minutes, 6 of 10 from the field, 3 of 7 from beyond the arc, and also gave you 5 rebounds with his 15 points, you'd say, nice little stat line for him. And it was. But even bigger than the box score is that he picks up 3 early fouls about midway, 9-minute mark in the second quarter, gets his 3rd foul, he comes out. And that really begins the run. This is a game, by the way, if you're talking about the excuses you can make around refereeing, you give up 136 points. It was going away from you there on the back end. But this is also a game where he surrendered 72 in the first half to the Timberwolves, 37 points in the first quarter alone. And by the way, Kessler Edwards was out there for those minutes. But in the second quarter, when Edwards goes off the floor, you start to see the impact and really the depth piece about this roster when he gets taken off the court. I mentioned the 3 of 7 from beyond the arc. He has the perimeter shooting, and the Brooklyn Nets, frankly, don't have anybody else capable of doing that once you get beyond Kyrie Irving, Patty Mills, and then to whatever extent you want to put it there with James Harden, obviously. We've highlighted on previous episodes where that's not the first phase of his game that you want him to lean into. Patty Mills was 5 of 10 from beyond the arc. You go down inside of the bench, you effectively did have Griffin just 1 of 2, James Johnson 1 of 2 as well, 1 of 2 for Cam Thomas late in this one, some garbage time minutes for him. But Kessler Edwards is exactly what this team needs, and everybody who's been following this team understands that. He gives you perimeter shooting on the offensive end, and then obviously is a very strong defensive presence. He's been proving that on a game-in, game-out basis. So when he exits with that 3rd foul, it starts this run for the Wolves, extended, I think, 17-6 or so, but effectively went +9 as that carried on over the next 5+ minutes, and that was basically the tale of this one. By the time you got to the break, you were already finding yourself trailing 72-62. So you're down by 10. You never really claw your way back into it, although over the 3rd and 4th quarter, you did get yourself down within 6 a couple of times, even down as low as 4. But it matters here. In the absence of Joe Harris, we saw it. Blake Griffin knocked down one of his triples, but it's obviously not his calling card. James Johnson, Bruce Brown. These rotations start to get really funky, and the spacing starts to get really lost, even with having James Harden and Kyrie Irving, because in the absence of Kevin Durant, there's nobody else to respect out there on the perimeter, and it certainly makes life a lot harder for James Harden. We saw that Kyrie Irving who has been in form since his return, was not affected by it. But you just don't have the same level of consistency on a possession to possession basis. And the unfortunate thing in this one here, we're going to get to the late game sequences, the decision from Steve Nash here on the back end. But I actually liked what you were seeing from James Johnson over the first, let's call it 3 quarters, because he was being played more at, even in positionless basketball, the 4, used in a rotation with Blake Griffin for a handful of minutes, and he was giving you some nice sequences. He brought the ball up a couple of times, made a couple of nice passes along the way, and then unfortunately, he ends up getting forced into an inexplicable role, quite frankly, at the back end of this one. But, I said it over on Twitter. I don't know what kind of hierarchy we want to put players in or if it really matters. But Kessler Edwards effectively represents the 5th most important player on this roster right now. Simply for the fact, to start, there's nobody else that can do what he does at that level of consistency for usually 30 plus minutes a game. And even in this one with the foul trouble, able to come back in, keep himself under control, and give you 29. And frankly, maybe this game does look a bit different, even with all the issues with the fouls, etc. If he gives you what he has been, which is closer to 38 than 29, couple more buckets here. And again, the spacing, the effectiveness, what type of sequences are available down in and around the glass for a Day'Ron Sharpe, for a LaMarcus Aldridge, who again had a bad game on his own. And we'll start to go into that a little bit here. Just 17 minutes for LaMarcus Aldridge, 3 of 8 from the field, and he ends up fouling out. But the big piece was that the mid-range shot was not falling. Again, in a game when you're going up against a guy like Karl-Anthony Towns, you want to throw in all the other pieces that the Wolves can kind of rotate in there. We won't even get to the Taurean Prince revenge game, as it'll be known, as he as he lit up the Nets, which he's done. He's done it in the past against Brooklyn. He's done it in the past against Atlanta when he was on the Brooklyn Nets. That's just a little bit of a side note, obviously. But it's difficult to continue to manufacture those same opportunities for LaMarcus Aldridge when you start to lose some of that spacing in and around. So there really is this kind of tumble effect in this game for me. James Harden has a bad start and can never find his rhythm. He turns the ball over. We mentioned him having at least a nice job from a facilitation standpoint, 13 assists in this game, but 6 turnovers, right? So that, and by the way, there's also a handful of ones, some really inexcusable bounce pass attempts that get knocked away inside the paint, looking for Day'Ron Sharpe, etc., that never quite get there. But Harden has the bad start, never finds his rhythm. Kessler Edwards picks up early fouls. Now he's taken out of it. And you're left with the Bruce Browns, Blake Griffins, James Johnsons of the world. And they just don't have the ability to create effective spacing on the floor for the Brooklyn Nets. And that I think really is what led to a lot of the issues here in this game, beyond everything else that we've highlighted. But he matters. And until Joe Harris returns, Kessler Edwards is a crucial piece to what the Nets do. And we've already talked about it once before. We don't really do too much speculation around the trade deadline. But if you're going to add somebody for one of the TPEs, if you're looking for a low level, maybe a swap somewhere in here, as we know, Paul Millsap is going to be looking to move on as well. And the Nets are going to try to accommodate him in that. Maybe you just get somebody that gives you reasonable defense and perimeter shot just to make sure, until you get Kevin Durant back sometime in 5-6 weeks, that you'll be able to look at it and say, we still have a viable option to bring it off the bench, because the small ball wasn't exactly working for them. And we're going to start to break that down as well in the closing segment when we take a look at Steve Nash. The other piece is really just when we talk about this game, we don't often look on the other side of it too much, but I really thought that it was a bad matchup from a lot of standpoints. We know, obviously, you come back in with D'Angelo Russell, 7 of 13 from the field. I thought that he really had a very even-keeled game. Didn't face a lot of challenges defensively. And again, when you lose Edwards like that early, and by the way, Anthony Edwards, who also suffered an injury, it seemed like late in this one, was going to the locker room, 8 of 17, got into his bag from the perimeter as well. It's hard to look at the Bruce Browns and say, you're going to go out and be this defensive stopper for us when we need to lean on somebody. That hasn't been the case this year. So now you also take that component out of it when things are getting out of hand and you feel like you're bleeding on the defensive end. There's no one that you can turn to in the same way that you had been able to last year as well. Let's get into the final sequences here. As I said, the coaching decisions around Steve Nash, and really something worth ripping him for a little bit. I think there's justified frustration when it comes to him. get into it in a second here. But before we do, got to tell you all about our friends over at Bet Online. That's because, of course, Bet Online would like to wish you a happy new year of betting as they continue to give you all those resources when you look at those NFL playoffs. My God, what a weekend it was, capping off with the absolutely insane game between the Bills and the Chiefs. Bet Online remains your number one spot for all the best sports wagering action for 2022. It's a new year, and that means a new updated desktop and mobile website to sign up for today. And when you do so, you'll receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. That's a 50% welcome bonus just for using a promo code Locked On, just like the podcast network you're listening to. When you get started signing up on your first deposit, 50% welcome bonus when you use promo code Locked On. From football, basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC, right down to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait. Take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. Also, of course, going to tell you very quickly here about an important little thing that the Locked On Network is doing. We appreciate you making the Locked On Nets podcast your first listen, and the NBA trade deadline is Thursday, February 10th at 3 p.m., and Locked On NBA will be covering it live from 2 to 4 p.m. That means that you can join Kim Becker, John Carolus of Locked On Celtics, and, of course, the Locked On Fantasy Basketball host Josh Lloyd and NBA veteran Antonio Daniels, to get the latest analysis of every blockbuster move that goes on. If we think that the Nets are going to do something to improve this team, the Locked On NBA show is going to have it all covered. Subscribe to Locked On NBA on YouTube and turn your notifications on so you know when they go live. It's going to be a really fun show. If you're looking for the Nets information or just to see where some of these big names could be moving around the league, be sure to give that one a listen. All right, so the last thing that we want to tap into here is, of course, the late game, what goes on, Steve Nash, and the rotations that he chooses to run with. Now, the precursor to this is Day'Ron Sharpe obviously has been in the starting rotation with no Nicholas Claxton. Plays 22 minutes, goes 4 of 7 from the field, gives you 9 rebounds, had a block, couple of turnovers, and 3 personal fouls, 8 points. And maybe even most notably, as we've said before on this show, the plus minus doesn't always matter unless it makes a case for our argument. And he was a +8 over those 22 minutes. Now, some of that does come at the back end of this one, so maybe get slightly skewed. But we have LaMarcus Aldridge get into foul trouble in this one. As we said earlier, just 17 minutes for him. He fouls out. And when he does, Steve Nash decides to go with a small ball lineup and inserts James Johnson. I said it before, I actually liked what he was doing over the first 3 quarters or so in the normal role that you want to have him in, whatever limitations it may have around it. Once you bring him in, though, and you put him on Karl-Anthony Towns, they go to the well, and they go to the well time and time again. He picks up fouls. He gets frustrated. There's even a sequence where he picks up the foul. It's his side out. He goes ahead and is still jawing with the referee. They inbounds to Karl-Anthony Towns, who turns and pulls up from the perimeter and knocks down a triple on him. It's a really difficult decision to wrap your head around from Steve Nash perspective. We said it before around Day'Ron Sharpe, and again, the plus minus tells you that you would have liked to see him get a little bit more of a run here. We understand that you're trying to protect yourself a little bit against the mistakes, the growing pains, but you have no one else on this roster that you can go to against Karl-Anthony Towns. Even, by the way, I could even say you should be throwing out Blake Griffin there, who's at least shown against more sizable, positions going back to last year against Giannis. He's been able to hunker down in the lane, use his body, and at least be a presence there. This is just not a matchup that you want to put James Johnson in. But that aside, and I'm not advocating for quality Blake Griffin minutes, but you got to run with Day'Ron Sharpe. You got to live with the results, even if he ended up fouling out. Right? We've seen him pick up fouls in bunches. Okay, so let him run out there. Let him pick up a bunch of fouls, get knocked out of the game, learn something from taking on the likes of Karl-Anthony Towns, and then put in James Johnson. Because, by the way, once they went back to Day'Ron Sharpe, he was out there on the perimeter. Karl-Anthony Towns was knocking down triples, very much in rhythm in this one. And it's a little bit confusing, I'll put it that way, to say the least. Now, the one caveat that I can give to it, if I want to, is that there is obviously the balancing of the books here. We're just going to take a quick look at the schedule before we get out the door. And a guy like Kessler Edwards, who picked up early foul trouble, was running 35, 38 minutes. I'm not saying that you're worried about fatigue on a young rookie, but you're obviously thinking about the balance of here's a guy that's been in the starting rotation and we're about to head home where we're not going to have Kyrie Irving. Likewise for Day'Ron Sharpe, we know that Nick Claxton's been dealing with the hamstring. So he's out and you've been running out Day'Ron Sharpe. Now the minutes have not been like Kessler Edwards, max 35 minutes a night. But I guess you could say that it's a fairly weak argument, and that's why I have a hard time leaning into it. At some point, you just have to accept that you have who you have, and then put the best man out there for the opportunity. And that's the only guy that you could have gone with. Now, whether or not it ended up being that the presence of Day'Ron Sharpe and maybe some collapsing help defense from James Johnson, if he's playing in there at the 4, or from James Harden, who was shading over and quite frankly didn't look great in those sequences either on the defensive end, where he was caught a little bit in no man's land, losing guys on the outside. But as the Wolves are starting to knock down more of their perimeter shots, maybe that's what you were going to have to live with. Taurean Prince torching you from the outside. But what you really can't do is essentially serve your defense up on a silver platter for the Timberwolves to lean into their best player in Karl-Anthony Towns. And that's exactly what Steve Nash did in this one. So that was pretty frustrating to say the least. And again, James Johnson for the minus 17 that he ended up giving you, and a lot of guys were in the negative here. It just seemed like you were really putting him in a difficult spot. Only 6 minutes for Blake Griffin in this one. Again, maybe you're going to try to balance the books here for the home trip and how you're going to use guys. I'm not telling you that Blake Griffin was going to be the Karl-Anthony Towns stopper, but I'd rather see him in there before I'd see Johnson, and I'd rather see Day'Ron Sharpe first and foremost playing out the string and living and dying with those results. So that was a bit of a head scratcher, I guess we could say that. The other thing that, again, this does remind you about is the depth piece. Dealing with these injuries, not being 100% healthy, the foul trouble issues all of a sudden make you very thin very quickly. And it only takes James Harden having an off night to all of a sudden find yourself looking down the barrel of a loss. And in that regard, the Nets end up finishing off this road trip 2-2. And we talked about it before. We know that Doug gave you the thesis around, is this going to be a potential concern as to what the Nets could be facing here down the back end of this stretch here without Kevin Durant? How are they going to survive without him? And you lose the game to Cleveland, but you come back and you win the next 2 and you feel pretty good about it. But now when you start to look at the schedule and you understand that they're about to head home to take on the Lakers, which obviously Kyrie will not be available for, and the Lakers are not the same team that we thought they were going to be, but the Nets are also not the same team that we thought that they were going to be. So they'll take on the Lakers. Then they'll also have Denver at home. Those are 2 very difficult matchups, especially if you think you're going to have to run James Harden max minutes to hopefully get some of those wins. When you get back out on the road and you get Kyrie back, you're going to run into the Golden State Warriors and the Phoenix Suns before you get maybe a soft landing spot there with the Kings. And then right back, though, on this 5-game trip with Utah and then Denver again before you head home for just a 1-game stop right back out on the road, Washington and Miami. So this schedule coming up here is it's good that you have so many away games and you can use Kyrie, and some of the matchups are going to be real tests for the Nets. And I think if you had been able to steal this one and given yourselves 3 out of 4 on this road trip, it would certainly be the cushion to say, even if you drop both of these home games here without having Kyrie Irving available, you get back out on the road and you look to split or go 2-3 over those 5-game stretch. I'm not telling you that any of these games aren't winnable for the Brooklyn Nets, but you see how razor thin that they're living with here. Claxton gets back out on the floor. You obviously then have one more body you can use. But you saw tonight, LaMarcus Aldridge, off night, not quite going his way, gets into foul trouble, difficult matchup. We've mentioned this before. Pace of play is an issue for LaMarcus Aldridge to be out on the floor there for you. When you look at these games, especially getting back out on the road, Golden State, that's one where he's going to get eaten up. The Phoenix Suns, he can get eaten up in that matchup again, right? So if we think that there's also now going to be games where LaMarcus is going to be a little bit less effective or less viable of an option, if Claxton's not there now all of a sudden you're looking a little bit at what you saw tonight, and maybe it's a wake-up call for Nash as far as just starting to really run Day'Ron for long minutes in some of these games, or finding out a more effective small ball lineup, because again, James Johnson can't be your way to balance the books. It highlights the importance of the players that they have available right now, and what a delicate balance that they're running here. Because I just highlighted their 3, 6, 9, 10-game stretch where only 3 of them, including the next 2, are going to be at home. 7 of them will be on the road. And if you're the Brooklyn Nets and you go 3-7, it's not unrealistic. I'm not saying it's the case. I'm not saying I'm not going to be looking at plus matchups in a lot of these opportunities, but if you go 3-7, all of a sudden, when you start to look at the Eastern Conference, it gets a little bit tighter, and you start to really look at the timeline for return, which maybe James Harden alluded to a little bit in his last post-game comments, where he said, after the All-Star break, when we get KD back and we get Joe Harris back, we'll get ourselves into form. Maybe that was a slip of the tongue. Maybe Harden knows nothing or everything, but you're going to start to look at this team and look at the standings, and every 2-3 games, it just feels like we are going to be saying, hey, what are the other teams in the Eastern Conference doing? And it's not about, are the Nets going to miss the playoffs, which we tried to drill home when Doug brought it up last time. But right now, they're the 2 seed. If you go 3-7 over those games, you're neck and neck with Chicago. Milwaukee's right there. Cleveland. So it's only going to take one bad run to all of a sudden find yourself in that 6, 7, 8 mix. And just, again, the fatigue factor, the role identification factor, the return of these players and getting healthy. The boxes you want to check before you get to the playoffs are important. And right now, the Nets have had to push a pause button on it. It's not an overreaction to any of these things, as we always say. Take each game in stride and look to turn the page and be more effective in the next one. That'll be Tuesday night, which, by the way, is at the Barclays Center. Well, you'll find myself and Doug Norrie. We're going to be at that game. If you are around, if you're going to be hitting it up, hit us up on social media in the comments on YouTube, where hopefully you're following and subscribing over there. Get at us over on Twitter at Locked On Nets, at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie, Blue Check Fresh. And we'll be sure to try to hook up with anybody that we can get a hold of there and just say hey to everyone, because we've obviously appreciated all the support, especially over on YouTube, where the numbers continue to grow. No quote on the solo show. Let's just continue to forge ahead, put this one in the rearview mirror as quickly as possible, and try to get ourselves back on track at home Tuesday night, taking on the Lakers. We will be back, of course, again, talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.